Someone asked me the other day if betrayal ever really goes away, and I started to say yes, then stopped myself, because that's the answer we're supposed to give, isn't it? You move on, you heal, you become stronger, all that. But if I'm being completely honest, that's not what I've seen happen. Not in my own life, not in anyone I know who's been through it. What actually happens is more like this. You're in the middle of a perfectly normal Tuesday, making coffee or sitting in traffic, and suddenly your chest tightens because some completely unrelated detail just reminded you of the moment you found out, and you realize it's been 3 years, or 5 or 10. There's this thing people do after betrayal where they perform recovery. They go through all the motions, say the right things, maybe even believe they've processed it. But then they're alone at night and the same loop starts playing. Did I miss the signs? Was I that blind? What does it say about me that I didn't see it coming? These aren't questions you ask once and resolve. They're more like a low hum in the background of everything else you do. You're at dinner with someone new, and part of you is running threat assessment. You're reading a text and passing it for subtext that might not even be there. You've become the kind of person who checks timestamps and notices inconsistencies, and you hate that about yourself, but you can't seem to stop. Actually, let me back up, because I don't want to make this sound hopeless. It's not about hope or lack of it. It's about accuracy. The myth we've been sold is that emotional wounds work like physical ones. You treat them, they close. Eventually, there's just a faint mark you barely notice. But betrayal doesn't work that way. It rearranges something fundamental in how you perceive trust, safety, and your own judgment. And pretending it doesn't, trying to force yourself back to who you were before, that's where people get stuck. If you're here because you're tired of being told you should be over it by now, or because you've noticed you're not the same person you used to be, and nobody seems to understand why, then yeah, stay. Subscribe if this kind of conversation is useful to you. Because we're going to talk about what actually stays with you, and more importantly, what you do with it. The first lie is that you get over it. That's the one everyone wants you to believe, and honestly, it's the one you want to believe too. Because the alternative, that this thing stays with you, feels unbearable when you're in the middle of it. So you read the articles, you do the work, you tell yourself the right stories. 6 months later, someone asks how you're doing and you say fine. Because what else are you supposed to say? And maybe you even mean it in that moment. But then something small happens, something that shouldn't matter, and your body responds before your mind catches up. That tightness in your throat, that need to check your phone even though there's nothing to check, that feeling of the ground shifting slightly under you even though you're standing still. I used to think this was a failure of discipline. Like if I just applied enough mental rigor, enough Stoic principles, I could logic my way out of the residue. But that's not how it works, and I don't know why it took me so long to see that. The whole framework of control versus non-control breaks down here because betrayal sits in this strange middle space. You can't control that it happened. You can't control the fact that it changed something in you. What you can control is whether you lie to yourself about it or not. There's someone I know who got blindsided by their partner after 8 years together. Everyone kept telling them they'd move on, find someone better, all the standard reassurances, and they did move on in the sense that they started dating again, built a life that looked functional from the outside. But they told me something once that stuck with me. They said it's like having a joint that healed wrong after a break. It works, you can use it, but it's never quite the same. There's a hesitation now that wasn't there before. Not weakness, just recalibration. Your system learned something it can't unlearn. That's what people miss when they push this narrative of complete recovery. You're not supposed to go back to who you were. That person didn't have the information you have now. They didn't know what you know about how quickly certainty can dissolve. And there's actually something useful in that, something that builds a different kind of steadiness if you stop fighting it. You're not trying to retrieve innocence, you're learning to carry yourself with the weight of your own experience, which is heavier than before, but also more grounded. There's a difference between having a scar and keeping the wound open. I know that sounds obvious, but watch how people actually behave after betrayal, and you'll see most of us can't tell the two apart. We mistake remembering for reliving. We think if we're not actively bleeding, we must be pretending it never happened. So we stay in this weird middle ground where we acknowledge the damage but refuse to let it settle into anything resembling information. A scar is just your body's way of saying something happened here, and we adapted. It's not pretty, it's not the original tissue, but it's functional. It holds. And there's a version of that for emotional injuries too, except we don't trust it. We keep poking at it, checking if it still hurts, almost disappointed when it doesn't hurt as much as it used to. Like the pain was proof we cared, and without it, we're somehow complicit in our own betrayal. That's the trap. The gravity of what happened can anchor you without drowning you, but only if you stop confusing memory with identity. Actually, I need to be more precise about this, because I see people make the opposite mistake too. They'll say they've moved on, they've learned their lesson, but then you watch them operate, and it's clear they've just built their entire personality around not being fooled again. Every conversation becomes a test. Every moment of vulnerability gets immediately walked back. They're not carrying the scar, they're performing it, making sure everyone knows they can't be hurt like that anymore, which is really just another way of saying the wound is still running everything. Someone close to me dated again after a brutal ending, and they had this tell. Whenever things started feeling too comfortable, too easy, they'd create distance. Not consciously, not as strategy. Just this automatic recalibration where comfort itself became the red flag. Because the betrayal happened after years of comfort, so somewhere in their nervous system, ease meant danger. That's what happens when you let the scar dictate terms instead of just existing as data. The mark becomes the lens through which you see everything, and you lose the ability to assess what's actually in front of you versus what you're projecting onto it. The Stoics had this idea that you don't control what happens to you, but you control what you make of it. And what most people make of betrayal is a permanent state of defensiveness, which I get. That thick skin feels like protection. But protection from what exactly? From being wrong about someone again? You're going to be wrong about people. That's not avoidable. The question is whether you can be wrong without it shattering you. And that only works if the original break actually healed into something dense and immovable, not something you're still trying to hold together with your hands. You'll notice it most clearly in how you listen now. Someone tells you a story, and there's this split-second delay before you respond, like you're running it through extra filters you didn't used to have. Not because you've decided to be skeptical, but because your system upgraded its threat detection without asking your permission. You're measuring sincerity differently, weighing words against tone, against context, against past behavior, doing this entire calculation in the pause between their sentence and yours. It's exhausting, actually. And people mistake it for coldness. But it's not cold, it's just careful in a way you weren't before. Someone says they'll call and you don't organize your evening around it anymore. Someone apologizes and you accept it without immediately restoring access. There's this measured quality to how you move through relationships now, this restraint that looks like detachment but is really just you requiring proof over time instead of taking things at face value. And honestly, I don't think that's damage, I think that's data. The strange part is how guilty you feel about it, like you're doing something wrong by not offering the same undefended openness you used to. There's someone I know who met someone great after a hard ending, and they kept apologizing for being slow to trust, kept explaining their hesitation like it was a character flaw that needed disclaimers. But the other person said something interesting. They said they'd rather be with someone who trusts deliberately than someone who trusts reflexively, because one of those is a choice, and the other is just habit. That surgical precision in how you evaluate people now, that's not bitterness disguised as wisdom. That's pattern recognition functioning the way it's supposed to. You're not cynical, you're just done pretending that wanting something to be true makes it true. And maybe you do take longer to let people in. Maybe there's a composure to you now that reads as distance. But distance isn't the same as closed. It's just the space you need to see clearly. But here's what nobody tells you about. And maybe this is the hardest part to articulate. There's this specific kind of loneliness that sets in after betrayal that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be in a room full of people. You can be in a new relationship. You can be laughing at something genuinely funny, and underneath all of it, there's this quiet hum of disconnection. Like you're watching yourself participate in your own life from a few inches behind your eyes, present but not entirely there. And the worst part is, you can't explain it to anyone, because externally, everything looks fine. I'm trying to think of how to describe this without making it sound more dramatic than it is. It's not depression exactly. It's more like you've become aware of a gap between what you show people and what you actually feel, and once you see that gap, you can't unsee it. Someone asks how you're doing and you say good, and you mean it in the sense that nothing is actively wrong, but there's also this awareness that you're operating at a remove from your own experience. You're functional, you're handling things, but there's a numbness in the center of it all that you've gotten so used to you almost forget it's there until something reminds you. There was a stretch where I'd be having dinner with friends and realize I hadn't actually heard the last 5 minutes of conversation, not because I was thinking about something else, but because I'd just drifted into this internal silence that's hard to climb out of once you're in it. And you can't tell people that. You can't say I'm here, but I'm also not here. I care about you, but I'm also watching this from a distance. I'm fine, but I'm also fundamentally disconnected from everything, including myself. So you just smile and nod and hope nobody notices the lag time between their question and your answer. Actually, I wonder if this is what sovereignty feels like when you strip away the romantic version. Not some liberated sense of freedom, but this untethered quality where you're not quite bound to anything anymore because binding yourself to things is what got you hurt. You wanted to be weightless, and now you are, but weightless also means nothing holds you. You're not caged by anyone's expectations or lies, sure, but you're also not connected in the way you used to be. And maybe that's the trade. Maybe that breathing room you needed also created a gap you can't fully close even when you want to. People see the composed exterior and think you've mastered something. And in a way you have. You've mastered the art of being present without being vulnerable, engaged without being invested, open without being penetrable. But that mastery comes at a cost nobody sees, which is that you're living slightly outside your own life now, and you're not sure how to get back in. Or if you even want to. Because getting back in means risking that feeling again. And you've worked too hard to build this protective distance to just give it up because you're tired of being alone inside your own head. The dangerous thing is how easy it becomes to make betrayal your defining characteristic. Not intentionally. You don't wake up one day and decide that being the person who got hurt is going to be your whole personality. It happens gradually, in how you frame stories about yourself, in how you explain your reactions, in the way you preemptively tell new people about it like it's a warning label, and at some point you realize you've been introducing yourself through the lens of what someone else did to you, which means they're still writing your narrative years after they left. I've watched people do this, and I've done it myself, if I'm being honest. You're at a party, and someone asks why you're single or why you're so guarded, and instead of just saying you're working on yourself or you're taking your time, you launch into the story. And the story becomes this shield you hold up to justify every cautious choice, every wall you've built, every connection you've avoided. It's protective in a way, sure, but it's also a trap. Because as long as your identity is organized around what was done to you, the person who did it still has bone-deep access to who you are. There's this raw honesty required to admit that you might be clinging to the injury. Not the memory of it, but the identity it gave you. The wronged party, the one who knows better now, the one who won't be fooled again. These feel like positions of strength, but they're really just another form of being controlled. You think you've stripped down to some essential truth about human nature and your place in it, but what you've actually done is let one experience calcify into a filter that blocks out everything that doesn't confirm it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about not letting the past dictate your perception of the present, though I'm paraphrasing badly. The idea is that every moment offers you clarity if you can see it without dragging old conclusions into it. But when being betrayed becomes who you are, you can't see anything cleanly anymore. Every interaction gets run through that old template. Every vulnerability is measured against that one time it destroyed you. And the person who hurt you. They're gone, living their life probably not thinking about you at all while you're still structuring your entire existence around the fact that they existed. That's not wisdom. That's just letting them keep the keys. So let me reframe something, because I think we've been looking at this backwards. The fact that betrayal leaves a mark on you isn't proof that you're broken. It's proof that you were real. You showed up fully. You trusted without a safety net. You let someone matter enough that their actions could actually land. And most people, if we're being completely honest, never risk that kind of exposure. They keep one foot out the door from the beginning, hedge their emotional bets, maintain plausible deniability about how much they care. You didn't do that, which means the aftermath hurts more, sure, but it also means you had the backbone to be vulnerable when being vulnerable is the least strategic thing you can do. There's someone I used to know who got completely wrecked by a friendship ending. Not romantic, just a friend they'd known since childhood, who turned out to be talking about them behind their back for years, and they kept saying they felt stupid for not seeing it, weak for how much it hurt, naive for trusting someone that deeply. But I remember thinking, no, you're not weak for feeling this. You're just someone who was willing to believe that loyalty meant something. The person who betrayed you is the one who operated from a defensive crouch the whole time, never fully committed, never actually there. You were there. That's not a flaw in your character. That's the entire point of being human. Actually, I need to push back on myself here because I don't want this to sound like I'm romanticizing the pain. I'm not saying the hurt makes you noble or that suffering builds character or any of that. What I'm saying is that the capacity to be hurt this badly requires a kind of quiet confidence most people avoid developing. You have to believe you can survive loss to risk caring that much in the first place. You have to trust your own steadiness enough to let yourself be shaken. And yeah, you got shaken. Maybe you're still shaking. But the alternative is going through life in a permanent defensive stance, never letting anything touch you deeply enough to leave an impression. And that's not strength. That's just fear dressed up as self-protection. Seneca talked about how the wise person doesn't avoid suffering, they meet it without being diminished by it. And I used to think that meant you were supposed to be unmoved, untouched, this unshakable pillar that nothing could affect. But that's not what he meant. He meant you carry the weight of your own experience without letting it collapse you. The mark is there, the weight is there, but you're still standing, still capable of holding the line between what happened and what you make of it. That's the actual test. Not whether you got hurt, but whether you let the hurt convince you that opening up was a mistake to begin with. People who've never been betrayed like this, who've kept themselves at a safe distance from everyone they claim to care about, they'll tell you you're too sensitive or too invested, or that you should have seen it coming. And what they're really saying is they're terrified of being in your position. Because your position requires showing up without guarantees. It requires carrying yourself through the world like someone who believes connection is worth the risk, even when the risk proved catastrophic. And that takes more guts than most people will ever admit. Which brings us to the actual question, the one that matters more than whether it stays with you or not. Because it does stay, we've established that. The question is, what you do with what stays. Do you carry it like dead weight, something that drags behind you and slows everything down? Or do you carry it like information, like a recalibration that makes you more deliberate about where you place your trust and how you move through the world? There's a version of you that emerges from this where every scar becomes a reason to stay closed. Where the lesson you take away is that people can't be trusted, that vulnerability is weakness, that the smart move is to keep everyone at arm's length forever. And I understand that impulse. It feels surgical, efficient, like you've finally figured out how to protect yourself. But that's not protection. That's just a different kind of prison where you're both the guard and the prisoner. The other version, the one that actually requires something from you, is learning to be patient with your own process, not rushing to conclusions about what this means about you or about people in general. Staying composed enough to notice the difference between reasonable caution and blanket defensiveness. There's someone I respect who went through something brutal and came out the other side with this unflinching clarity about what they would and wouldn't accept going forward. Not bitter, not closed off, just measured. They didn't pretend the experience didn't change them. They let it refine their standards without letting it dictate their capacity for connection. That's the move, I think. You acknowledge that your nervous system updated its software. You accept that you're going to be more careful, more observant, slower to fully invest. But you don't mistake carefulness for cynicism. You don't confuse restraint with shutdown. The Stoics understood that wisdom isn't about avoiding pain. It's about integrating what pain teaches you without being ruled by it. You're different now. Fine. Use the difference. Let it sharpen your discernment. Let it make you someone who chooses with intention rather than hope. But don't let it make you someone who stops choosing altogether, because that's not dignity. That's just letting the betrayal win in slow motion. So 6 months from now, if you actually let this settle instead of fighting it, here's what changes. You're sitting across from someone new and they say something that would have triggered every alarm you have, but this time you pause. Not because you're scared, but because you're assessing. And the assessment is clean. No overlay of old wounds, no projecting past betrayals onto present moments. Just, is this person showing me who they are and do I believe them? You've become someone who can hold two truths at once. Yes, you were hurt. Yes, you can still choose to trust selectively. The two don't cancel each other out. You'll notice you're less reactive. Someone cancels plans, and instead of spiraling into here we go again, you just take it as information. Maybe they're flaky. Maybe they had a genuine conflict. Either way, you're not building a case in your head before you have the facts. That frantic energy that used to accompany every small disappointment, that's mostly gone. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped needing every interaction to prove or disprove your worst assumptions about people. Actually, no, let me be more honest about this. The biggest shift might be how you talk about what happened. Right now, it's probably this defining event you return to constantly. The explanation for why you are the way you are. 6 months from now, if you do the work, it's just something that happened. Still significant, still part of your story, but not the entire plot. You can mention it without your voice changing. You can remember it without that tight feeling in your chest. It's become context, not content. And that might not sound like much, but it's everything. Or maybe I'm overpromising. Maybe it takes longer than 6 months. I don't know your situation specifically, but the direction is right even if the timeline isn't exact. Look, if this was useful to you, subscribe if you haven't. It's free, and it means this kind of content keeps reaching people who might need to hear it. Leave a like on the video. There's a hype button that shows up right after. Click that if you want to help even more. I know it's a small thing to ask, but those actions genuinely make a difference in who gets to see these conversations. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.